I have the opportunity to thank the board members of the Thunder Bay Community Pasture, and here Mike Huber, but I can also thank Larry Bockus, who's present today. He was the really the first contact I had to set up the first part of the presentation, which is an overview of what the Thunder Bay Community Pasture is about. So Christine O'Reilly, forage specialist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Foods and Rural Affairs, OMAFRA, along with Kendall Donahue. She's been replaced since, but she was really an advocate for rotational grazing and invited me to a workshop that was part of the whole set of ideas here. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Marin Longcar, PhD student who's just starting at Lakehead University. He was going to start on farm work, but he shifted partly through the personal interest, partly through the first time failure to get funding with the Beef Cattle Research Council on this project. He's now looking at forest fire behavior and remote sensing to give us better early warnings of fire spread when it hits the canopy. So, but Marin is acknowledged here because he put together several of the ideas for possibilities, in particular herd management. So what I've done is divided this talk into 3 pieces. So first I will talk about the state of soils and the forage crop on the community pasture from some work done 4 years ago on the community pasture. I then will talk about herd management, speaking as a behavioral ecologist. So I funded this work with work that is related to the behavior of ungulates. I've worked with a lot of systems where ungulates are free of predators or with predators, and their behavior differs a fair bit. Of course, in the farm environment, we're mostly free of predators, and there are some options for herd management to be part of rotational grazing. So the bottom of the slide, you see NSERC. It was my discovery grant that funded some of the first part of this presentation's data collection, but also the opportunity for additional funding would be remiss if it didn't acknowledge NSERC for building ideas in my head. That's the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. And I wanted to conclude with a few of the benefits with conservation grazing in general, which includes rotational grazing, but also some other management, much of which is in place in the US. So I chose a couple of sources in Wisconsin that are representative of pretty similar situations to what we have in Ontario. So this photo was taken during that NSERC-funded research when a student and an assistant through a youth employment grant were hired to do some forage plant survey. So you see a typical scene in the summer or early summer on the pasture. This is the main pasture in O'Connor Township. Like all of the community pastures in Canada, really, the reason for their existence is an acknowledgement that many family farms don't have the extent to offer free ranging on sufficient land for high enough carrying capacity for cattle. They may be able to sustain the winter with hay bales, and in the summer the trend is to put them out to a community pasture. So land was acquired between 1954 and 1972 with the main area at the congruence of two highways, 595 and 590, and just west of Kakabeka Falls, and in fact very close to Larry Bockus' home. So Larry served as pasture manager at the time of our sampling. In total, in that period of about 20 years, there were 400 hectares acquired with 4 different land purchases. And since the purchases of the land, there was very limited forage improvement. I'm told there was a period of some experimental seeding. There has been talk of fertilizing and other ways to improve the forage crop, but nothing serious until the rotational grazing workshop that I mentioned, that was launched with efforts of Kendall Donahue, the regional OMAFRA rep, and others who wanted to see what could be done. So just as we were finishing the summer crop sampling in August of 2019, the first of the interior fences were set up in the pasture with a main goal to separate the area that was heaviest grazed near the entrance to the community pasture and near the main watering area, which is part of a wetland complex that is just in the near background of this photograph, right where you see a couple of trees. The cows are in the heaviest grazed area. While this picture's up, I don't think it's repeated again, but you get an idea of what happened on a given day. It could almost be predicted that mid-afternoon, several of the beef cows, that belong to different owners who rent their space for the summer, would come and approach the samplers. This photo was taken, but they're a mix of cattle from small herds, a lot of them cows, heifers, and calves from different family farms, and so cohesive to an extent. You see this little group, and maybe some of the neighbors would travel together, but very difficult to manage in the sense of perfect rotational grazing without a lot of fences and a lot of control of cattle that every summer are maybe reacquainted, but probably more likely than not acquainted with new neighbors who don't know each other. So it's quite a mix of non-cohesive groups of cattle. One of the things that we could do, because there was another project that was looking to compare land clearing and very recent clearing of forest for increased land area with a pretty strong market push for higher beef cattle heads in the region, was the opportunity to compare soils. What do soils recently cleared for pasture look like compared to soils that are more under best management practices on dairy or beef farms? So a student was already working with the Cornell University soil health rating. That's, as probably most of you know, what sort of underpins the Ontario guidelines. You can get an overall rating score at the bottom of the chart here out of 100. So, almost to 90% for the Thunder Bay Community Pasture, which means that despite over 40 years of use by area cattle, the soils are pretty good, including in the organic matter content. Anything over 8 percent is good, and the surface soils are about 9.1%. We see a transition from the surface soils to the deeper soils that include deeper roots of the grasses and less organic matter overall compared to forest. Again, that was sort of a sneaky way of putting the pasture soils into an assessment. We tied them in with a matrix of comparing forest versus agriculture soils. The results of that study were an initial decline in the organic material, but with good management, a stable amount of organic matter, therefore good water holding capacity, good aggregate stability, macronutrients in good supply. The one recommendation we made from a soil sample was not unlike a lot of boreal soils in Northern Ontario, a pretty low pH. So if it was over 6, closer to 7, maybe even over 7, you probably have more available macro and micronutrients. This led to a recommendation in our study, which again took place in 2019 before any improvements on the pasture. We said, a possible improvement might be liming. Again, there's not a lot of funds available, given the rental income for the community pasture for artificial means of fertilizing, but there was some thought that maybe wood ash, which is readily available, would be a way to improve soils, and that's not uncommon. Sorry, the animation's a little bit off here. When we looked at yields of forage plants and forage quality, we had 3 sample areas, one in the west with the entry to the pasture just off Highway 595 right here. So the heaviest grazed area, which would now see sort of a fence running about like this, installed by the end of our 2019 sampling season. At least the fence posts were in. We also had a northern sampling area. So you can see some trees here. This was a partly treed area with the need for the cattle to cross this wetland area, visited less often. So we were comparing a heavily grazed to a less heavily grazed area, and then this adjacent fence block here. Not part of the main pasture, and in fact, the fences are kind of deteriorated. I was told. So this past summer, it was not used as a grazing area. I'll come back to this area because part of the herd management experiments that I had planned were to set up sort of staging areas as individual farmers would move their smaller herds to the community pasture. A few were selected to maybe be part of an experiment run in this area. So additional fencing was part of a proposed research project. Again, it was not funded, but I'll come back to this. But in a couple of the slides, we have the opportunity to compare heavily grazed to less heavily grazed to an area with a very different use. So the majority of the cattle being on the main pasture, the adjacent field was used less. So if we just look at our sort of end of June, early season yields, bearing in mind that grazing was already sort of underway for a few weeks when we did this sampling, we see what's typical for heavily grazed areas in the what's called the Western sampling site. We had 3 sample plots, transects, where we took several 2-meter by 2-meter plots to estimate yield. So lower yield of grasses in the heavily grazed area, lower yield of forbs, somewhat lower yield of legumes, but actually a higher yield of legumes, probably because of release of competition from grasses in the sorry, let me rephrase that. lower yield of legumes, very low yield of legumes in the heavier grazed area. But in the next slide, you will see that these kind of dominate the community, probably because grasses are less of a dominant factor, typical for heavy grazing. And if we look at total yields, what is available for cows to eat, it is higher where you have less grazing. And this is just above ground biomass, combining grasses, forbs, and legumes. You'll see that it's a little bit less, but still much higher in the adjacent field. So here's what I was referring to just a minute ago when I made a little error. You can see that the clover is a little bit on the higher side in the heavier grazed western area, just using this graphical representation of forage plant abundance. You'll also see that Plantago, an introduced species, this species of forb, also introduced. This is bedstraw. 3 introduced species, very tolerant forbs that probably succeed where heavier grazing reduces grasses. Where pressure is a little bit less on the grasses in the northern area, we also have indicator plants that are introduced, like this thistle, Circium. It's together with native plants like dogberry and raspberry and serviceberry. So in areas that are less grazed, but very typical for what's shown in many rotational grazing studies, often south of the border, you'll get the diversity and dominance of forbs increasing. Forbs and some woody plants like rubus and amelanchier, raspberry and serviceberry or juneberry, slightly higher in the mix. When we look at the adjacent field, you still see a different community, but one that's dominated here by Gallium borale, an introduced species, and some native species like goldenrod. So here we have a comparison that's really important in terms of plant response. Above ground mass, which is available to foraging herbivores. Below ground mass, which is in native grassland an important part of primary productivity, and a way in which organic carbon is increased in the soil, shifting a number of communities, arthropod and fungal communities, that tend to put the grassland into a healthier soil condition. So the higher productivity, the better the condition below ground comparing native communities. And then we have the ratio of ratio of above to below ground, which should be lower where you have better health. So now we're comparing a community of grasses to a community of legumes to a community of forbs that dominate the system. And you'll see that if in this case, we're looking at individual plants, and so I weighed the mass of individual plants, the above ground number of grams per plant is higher in the less grazed area for grasses, higher for legumes, and higher for 2 out of 3 of the forbs. Below ground biomass, again, important comparing to native communities, we actually see higher for the red top, with larger plants overall for red top in the less grazed area. But in fact, higher below ground with that investment in below ground production when you top the plants. So a lesson here that Christine O'Reilly picked up on quickly is that looking at grasses and even looking at the relatively high below ground production of legumes and forbs, even in the heavier grazed western part of the community pasture, there is potential. So, even with invasive plants being a big part of the community, there's potential for native plants and typical forage plants in a pasture to recover. Looking at above ground to below ground ratios, they are better for grasses in the less grazed areas, better for legumes in the less grazed areas, and perhaps slightly better for some of the perennials or forbs in the heavier grazed areas. So we also looked at chemical concentrations, so nutrient concentrations, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in the plants. They were lower in the less grazed site, but we considered this an indication of bigger plants altogether, especially for grasses and forbs, grasses and legumes in the less grazed area, sort of having a bigger intake if the whole plant is eaten, but a lower concentration. So the larger size of the forage plants already noted for the field that was less grazed in the northern part of the pasture can dilute nutrient concentrations. And again, reflecting Christine's assessment that soil and forage are in pretty good condition even before any sort of management was considered for the community pasture. We have nutrient concentrations falling within or above normal ranges for pastures, comparing published literature. So shifting to the second part of this talk, briefly, what I wanted to present was a couple of ideas, and they're sort of a niche kind of idea set, where if you have a setting like in a lot of larger pastures in northern Ontario, where even a few fences will not take us much beyond the conventional grazing system, what can you do to emulate what is supposed to happen with rotational grazing, where you don't have dispersed groups across the pasture, but you have the sort of the bison system that is often compared, where you have strong leaders and followers that set up this sort of herd. The herd doing something in the extreme, like mob grazing, where they might spend a day on a portion of the pasture, and the benefits come from saliva, urine, feces that are sort of deposited, but then the area is left for 30 days, and maybe it's not returned to every day, it's returned to instead a month later, a year later. How are bison in that system sort of managing themselves, and how can that self-management of the herd be part of the overall goal of forage improvement? So a study done in Japan was an experimental study that I wanted to repeat, again, introducing in sort of a initial sort of entry area for herds that are cohesive from individual family farms. It was Jason Reed who told me that the farmers know who the lead cows are. The farmers know who the follower cows are. The lead cow is often a heifer, a younger female that has gained that higher social rank. Marin Lunkar showed that in bison, almost all the foraging decisions are determined by where the animal is on the rank, who gets to the highest productivity areas, and it's kind of everybody else follows. And so this study in Japan was something I wanted to reproduce, where in that adjacent field on the west side of Highway 595, we would say, okay, can we determine the leader cow's behavior? Can we determine how long a leader cow stays in a pasture before she gives it up, before she moves into a kind of a maze setting where the next paddock in an experimental paddock system is not visible, but has to be entered through a series of gates. Who follows her? Does everybody follow her? So cameras mounted on drones and cameras mounted on the fences were to observe whether there is really that much control for small groups that are based on social foraging rules. So the next part of our proposed studies was observational, and the idea here was that we would have cows in the first of the rotational grazing paddocks, roughly free ranging, roughly in a mix of less cohesive groups, but who followed who? We would number the cows, we would observe them again from cameras on drones, and at the same time we would observe as they move through an area, when they make the decision that they've depleted an area, what is the forage height? What is the health of the plants and soil? So we would have a team following the relatively free-ranging groups in the rotational grazing system. So it turns out Amandine Ramos, a French researcher, is a sort of a writer in how we can use social network rules for cattle and other ungulates, sheep, wild ungulates, to see how behavior determines use of pasture. And if you look up Amandine Ramos, her work is part of a whole rewilding initiative. And I don't want to get too far off track here. I'm all for the slow improvement of farms used for beef and dairy cattle, but in Europe, and also to some extent in the US, and probably increasingly in some of the protected areas in Canada, we see the past where there were more free-ranging ungulates as one that we may want to emulate under Amandine Ramos's ideals. This is part of a rewilding of Europe that's been a movement for the past couple of decades, where rewilding means that you bring back savanna or prairie environments that were not seen after the agricultural revolution in Europe that accompanied the expansion of the Roman Empire. Same thing in North America with colonization of North America by Europeans. There was a movement away from tall grass prairie. So my final couple of slides do describe what initiatives exist in Wisconsin and other states in the US. Many Western states are all about what you might do to restore tall grass prairie, to restore oak savanna. Again, sort of a limited distribution in Northern Ontario, but a relevant topic. There is a tall grass native prairie area in Stanley, not far from the community pasture. So conventional stocking or free-ranging cattle can be compared to alternatives. I've talked about rotational grazing, and another option is intensive early stocking. What that means is you may have your herd confined later in the summer, but in early years they're managed to take on very high stocking rates in a free-ranging environment, but not with a mob grazing kind of approach, intensive grazing. Patch burn grazing is another idea, especially prominent in tall grass prairie, which have actually lost compared to previous distributions. They're at sort of about maybe 10% at best of their previous distribution. The prairies, of course, with fire control, with crops, other crops, not forage crops on prairies, you're looking at low fire. Fire can be used to improve pasture. It was done pre-colonization of North America, and the way patch burn grazing works in a free-range setting, again, no fences required. The cattle are just on the on the prairie because they see the immediate benefits of regeneration of grasses after fire. What that does is free up other areas for numerous improvements, including the habitat structure that is not present when cattle are sort of having a dilute effort across a pasture. So this is an example of patch burn grazing, where this herd of cattle is following patches that have been burned, but in the foreground, other patches are not used that have the kind of structure that protects grassland nesting birds. And nesting success can be much higher, including for species at risk like bobolink, but quite a range of diverse birds and even mammals like some of the mammals that in the prairies they don't want, like the black-footed ferret. They do really well when the structure is intact for areas that aren't burned or areas that are fenced off for 30 days for a year. Again, we can restore the tall grass prairie, including amazing to me to read hundreds of species of forbs that are typical of the less grazed parts of the community pasture, but typical of a tall grass prairie would be restoration of above and below ground biomass of forbs. Higher grass production for some of the most important grasses in tall grass prairie, little and big blue stem switchgrass, Indian grass. Again, those native grasses absent from the community pasture as an example. And of course, we're restoring organic carbon, and in so doing, we're ultimately restoring nitrogen stocks. A native tall grass prairie will have 60% of the net primary productivity occurring below ground. So this is a picture in Wisconsin where we're closest to the recommendations that include restoration of native tall grass prairie. You can see the perennials, the forbs in the foreground. You can see that this is newly exposed to this herd. You can see a fence in place. Sometimes the fences are underground with electrical current moved, so you don't have to physically move the cows. You just have to be sure you're opening and closing virtual gates on your community. I could have shown a picture of an Ottawa Valley farmer who's sold on this, and he can still go, as he mentioned, out with his wife to dinner or to a theater, and use his app to open and close gates here. But this would be an area that was mob grazed and may not be grazed for another 30 days, and the cows are moved over. So the net effect is a healthier ecosystem overall. So that's my little overview. Yeah, I went a little longer than I suggested, Leah, but I hope I kind of covered points that are of interest to everybody.
Yes, thank you very much, Brian. That was all very good information, and no problem for going a little over. We really appreciate your time and expertise today. So we're going to leave questions for Brian until after Larry speaks, and then we can have an open floor with anybody who is on the call. And Betty, yes, there is a recording. This is being recorded. And we can provide that to you later. Very good. So I'm going to pass it over to Larry. And yes, just as I'm asking you to unmute, you can press your unmute button now, Larry, on your own screen, I think.
Okay.
There you are. So, and just for all the participants, I'll just say that Mike Huber is a little occupied with harvest right now. All is well, and the weather is great, as a lot of you might know. And Larry happily was able to participate tonight, and he has also been the manager of the Thunder Bay Community Pasture. Take it away, Larry.
Well, thanks, Brian. That was a good refresher to some of the material presented a few years ago. And you comment about the potential being there for more growth later would probably explain some of the resurgence we saw even in the first year of a partial rotation. It was only this past year we had a full rotation going in all the pastures. Prior to that, we had one pasture with a couple of fences, and we could kind of experiment a little bit, but that was about the extent of it. But I was surprised at the resurgence in such a short time between last year and again this summer. I didn't expect that much. And I see with some of what Brian was saying there, that would explain some of the rapid regrowth we saw. And we've definitely seen, I didn't get a good count last year, just did a spot check on the gains, which every farmer wants to know how much gain they're having in their cattle. And last year they gained about a half a pound per day per cow more than they had in the previous records of the previous 6 years. I haven't seen the figures yet for this year, but looking at the condition of the cattle and the comments of some of the owners, it looks very good. So we'll know when the cattle come off in another couple of weeks, see the actual scale. I didn't get a chance to check how many kilometers of cross fencing we actually put in. It was somewhere around about 16 kilometers, I think, of 3-wire electric fencing went in. And I had all the figures, but I didn't have a chance to look it up until I was notified that Mike was absconding. But it's definitely going to be worth it. The pastures had received some sporadic management as far as soil and seeding and fertilizer some years in the past, but the last number of years prior to my coming on, there hadn't received any real attention. And in my opinion, some parts of the pasture had been rather overgrazed of all the fields. Now I have to remember we have 4 pastures and none of the boundaries are common. So they're all have to be, and the soils are different in each one. So they all have to be kind of managed differently. The one pasture to the south is a lot of, I used to call it wiregrass, June grass, there's other names for it, which is not a great forage for cattle. And it dies off easily in hot weather, which happened this spring. We had a month of hot weather. So basically a large part of that was brown by the time we wanted to put cattle on. Eventually with the rains, it picked up quickly. But by then it was a bit too late. But the other thing that happened with that month of dry weather we had this spring, it was actually very dry. We were actually managing the water supply at the various parts of we call them paddocks, but the grass wasn't an issue. Everywhere we went, we had the grass and it was coming through nicely. And I think, in my opinion, a large part of that, not only due to the recovery, but because of the higher density of forage there, it was shading the ground better. So the ground was not drying out. And being predominantly clay soils, which tend to hold water, sometimes to the detriment of the plants. It doesn't give up water easy, but it was more shaded. So the grasses were coming through quite well, despite the lack of rain and water for the first month this year. So that was another real big bonus. So as I say, we had to shuffle the cattle around more to manage the water than the grass. And now we'll be on pasture till the third week of October now, which is quite a bit later than usual. Usually it's anywhere between the early part of October to maybe the middle of October at best. So there's been a gain, definite gain that way too. There was, I think we would like to see the northern part there where a lot of the brushes have taken over part of the formerly cultivated lands of 30, 40 years ago. But some of the cattle are starting to knock that down a bit. I think the one pasture to the south where the June grass is predominant, it really is going to need attention to really increase its ability to carry more cattle over the course of those same months. So the cross fencing project itself, from the time we initiated it, it took about 3 years to complete. My wife Diana was very heavily involved in the paperwork there and got a lot of help from Kendall Donahue, as well as Emily Potter, name a couple of people that come to mind right away. But both of us said we wouldn't do it again. It took up the grant projects and the management of the paperwork and all that. It took up a lot of time, and we had no skills at this. So we were learning on the fly from wherever we could source it. Another trouble we ran into was, of course, being government and the bureaucracy. They wanted 3 quotes on everything. Well, in most cases, we were lucky to get 1 quote on anything. And so that was a tough nugget to push uphill till we could finally convince them that this is reality here. And fortunately, the fellow that did take on the construction part of the project, there was brush cutting involved, laying in new fence lines in some cases, through a new cut, and installing these wooden posts and 3-wire. He's a cattleman himself, which is really fortunate because he came up with some good suggestions while we were having our conferences right out in the field with the cow pads around our boots. And it worked out really well. And he did a good job. But because of weather conditions, again, supply issues, it dragged out over like three summers before we finally got it signed off officially last fall. But it has been worth it. I think being a community pasture too, with cattle coming in from a multiple of different sources, and as Brian said, all unfamiliar with each other, unfamiliar ground. The fencing has to take this into account. Whereas on home pastures, I think farmers could, once their cattle are conditioned to the electric fence, because of the older cattle being there, they train the younger ones. In many cases, they could have run a single strand electric or even temporary electric, whereas we're having to run wooden posts in, 4 and 5 inch wooden posts in with 3-strand of high tensile fencing. So that brought the work and the cost up considerably. And that cost has to be prorated over the next several years. But we're already, as I say, seeing some good benefits out of it. That now we can, especially with some of the work that Brian did, could prod us in certain directions. We can finally initiate some kind of more longer term management plan for the pastures themselves. There's a little more research going to be involved during the winter time, when people aren't trying to get their silage and hay off the fields. And Mike and I are still working pretty closely. He's taken over officially as pasture manager. But I said I'd be his assistant. And we still work fairly closely on a lot of things. And I'm available if he needs a second person to help. It sometimes happens. The cow is out or injured or something. You need a second person there to help. So I said I'll continue in that role, but Mike will be the primary. But he's a good person to talk over ideas and potential plans for the future, because he's had a lifetime of experience, even though he's a young fella. I can say that. Younger fella, he's had a lifetime of experience with cattle, which I really appreciate. But then I've done a lot of work in the past on forages and soil, so we kind of work together good on that, and we can kind of approach problems from different angles. So it's good to have more than one person involved, because I think a big problem in the past was that they only had one person as a pasture manager, and he wasn't really managing the way it should be. It's just checking on the cattle, and that was about it. So the pastures really suffered for those years. I should mention too, the community pastures, there's 11 of them in Ontario. They're really all owned by one corporation. People don't understand that. And that's the Association of Community Pastures, and they hold deed to all of the lands. And the individual community pastures have volunteer boards that manage the pastures at home. But we still report to the board, and they still hold the tenure on the land. And the community pastures, each of us were allocated a mortgage from the provincial government when I was handing over the land, and we were all assessed the value. We all had to pay off that mortgage individually, which was completed in about 2000, I think, if I remember correctly, or 2000, just in there somewhere. But again, to reiterate, it's owned by a corporation called the Association of Community Pastures, and a lot of people don't understand that. They even think it's township property. But it's not, and our board still has to report to a head board. Yeah, so in Ontario, which is again made up of a board of volunteers chosen from each of the community pastures. But up here, we usually have a different problems to contend with, whereas many of the pastures down south were cultivated at a much earlier age in history, and probably done a better job in the earlier parts of the history of their pastures, whereas here a lot of the land was cultivated or cleared probably in some cases almost 100 years later. So it was still really homesteaders just clearing land and doing whatever they could to make a go of it. And the grasslands that were established, much more attention or care since. So the history kind of puts us much further behind than Southern Ontario. And in many cases, our weather and rainfalls, temperatures, we have more oftentimes more in association with Manitoba than we do with Southern Ontario. Yes, and that's true with establishing forages. That's a fast and dirty one. We have about, in total, it varies a little bit from year to year. The board decides, we take applications in February, and the board sits down with the pasture managers and decides the allocation of which cattle on which pasture and what the numbers are going to be, and also which cattle or which pastures a bull can be assigned to. Now, the bull, the community pasture is not responsible for. That has to be communications and agreement between the various consigners, and the cost is borne by the consigners for the bull. We just simply make names and numbers available to the consigners themselves, insofar as who may have a bull and who may have one to bring. We don't want cattle born on pasture, so we started preg checking cattle when they go on in the spring now, and if they're carrying, they have to go back home. The reason for that is, one, the extra work for the manager, because he can't perhaps attend to the birthing properly, and also it leaves a potential attractant for wolves and bears, and there isn't somebody there constantly like there might be at home to manage that part of it, because essentially you're checking all the cattle at least once a week, and the various pastures are well spread out. You're covering a few miles to go to check each one of them and find the cattle. Mind you, with the paddock system now, it makes that so much easier to visually check the cattle and see if there's any down or missing, because now they're confined to a much smaller area. And the other advantage is that when we move from one paddock to the next, the cattle will eagerly see you coming and follow you. It's a race to the gate, really. And when they go through, it makes a nice, easy, especially if there's two of you, to check all the cattle as they go through the gate. So it makes it another additional way of a close inspection of the cattle, because many times when they're out in the field, they will shy away from you, especially if you're on foot. You can get close to them sitting on a machine, but if you're on foot, they'll oftentimes shy away from you. And if you think there's a foot problem, you can't get close enough to really see what the issue is. But you can check them when they go through the gate. And now, fortunately, it's one of the problems with better forage recovery. Now the grass is so high, you can't see the darn feet. So you're trying to get close enough and using binoculars to see what if it's a problem, it needs attention, or if it's just a temporary sprain. Yeah. I had talked before the start of this project. I talked with some people out in Nova Scotia who'd already done it, and they having close to the ocean, they having issues with the weather there.
First summer the Zoras had like burgers, right? And I bought them at Longo's, right? Like,
Uh-oh. We got somebody else here.
Sorry about that, Larry. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. But they, in a very short period of time, were almost able to double their carrying capacity on 100 and I think they had 125 acre community pasture there. So it made a substantial difference to them, because Nova Scotia, there's no such things as huge tracts of farmland for the most part, except in some small areas. So to have the extra community pasture available made a big difference to a lot of cattle owners. Because then they could either do some renovation at home or let the grass be cut for hay, and then bring the cattle back home at the end of the growing season. Oh, well, that was, and again, thanks to Brian for the work that he did. We were starting to do a longer term soil study, but it got interrupted with COVID and the wheels came off the wagon at that point. And we lost the whole project, but for the short time they were out there, they did get some pretty good information that we were able to use, and we're still probably go back to that, Brian, this winter and take another reading on it. I'm not too sure what else I can offer at this point. Is there any questions?
Thank you very much, Larry, for that talk. Okay, I'm going to stop this recording and allow the floor to be open for questions.